and welcome back. I hope you enjoyed the panel discussion. That will be available on Facebook and YouTube, and for staff, it's available on the intranet on Connected. Feel free to rewatch and submit any additional questions you have. We will try and get them answered by the experts and get back to you. Now, we're very excited for another edition of Inside Hollywood with Hawk Koch. Let's go to Zoom. Hi, guys.
Hi, everybody.
Hi there.
Hi, Jen. I hope everybody listened to the vaccination webinar, and if not, you'll be able to see it on our YouTube channel. But for right now, Hawk is going to be introducing one of the great casting directors in Hollywood. Well, you'll get the introduction, but I want to say a very special thank you to David, because he was one of our first daily call sheet volunteers, which just goes to show you can be somebody who's working in the industry, have a really busy day, be very successful, and still have time to give back. So thank you so much, David, for doing that, and look forward to hearing what you have to say about the importance of casting, because we wouldn't have any movies or TV without people like you. Thank you, and happy holidays to you and Hawk and families. Bye.
Hi, Greta. Hi, everybody. I think that, hello, Jen, am I on?
Oh, you're on. Yes, it's all you.
Okay. Good afternoon and happy holidays. I am Papa Hawk Christmas, or as some people call me, Rabbi Christmas. I believe that I'm bringing you a really great holiday gift. I get to interview, as Freda said, one of the preeminent casting directors in all of the world, not just the United States. And he's also, and I hope that I feel like I had a small part in this, he is the president of the Motion Picture Academy. And he is the first and only casting director to ever be president. We've had producers, executives, actors, actresses, but we've never had a casting director as our president. So just to give you a few of the films that David has cast: Gravity, Cold Mountain, The English Patient, My Best Friend's Wedding, little movies like Lars and the Real Girl, crazy movies like working with Mel Brooks on Spaceballs, My Cousin Vinny, which I guess, who is it? Some idiot lawyer likes to pretend that he's Vinny. And Get Shorty. I could go on, but why don't we just bring in David Rubin. David, welcome. And it's great to see you, buddy. Are you? There he is.
Hey, Hawk.
Hi,
hey,
David.
everybody.
Hi. Thanks.
Hawk.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I'm thrilled to be here with you. I am so fond of you personally, and whenever you call, I answer. And when I heard that this was for the Motion Picture Television Fund, my only response was, how soon can we get together? I love this organization so much. I had a very satisfying and fulfilling experience working with the Daily Call Sheet, and I think the world of Bob Beecher, and happy to be here.
Well, and we're thrilled and honored. So why don't we start at the beginning? Where did you grow up? Where were you born? Did you go to movies as a kid? Tell us about your childhood.
Well, I am a first-generation American. Beide meine Mutter und mein Vater waren aus Deutschland. Both my mother and my father were from Germany. And I was born in Manhattan. But my parents soon moved to Long Island, to the town of Great Neck, which was about a 25-minute drive from Midtown Manhattan. I think they both had done some research and recognized Great Neck as one of the preeminent, at least in New York, one of the preeminent school systems. And I think that was largely responsible for them moving there. My father died when I was very young, when I was 2.5. My mother did not remarry, so I was essentially an only child of a single mother. And I had a great childhood in comparative suburbia, though New York City was really ultimately my playground. and I began getting involved in theater at a very early age in school. I think the first time, and just tell me to stop with my chronology when you want, but the first time was a third grade play, which was the story of William Tell, in which I not only played William Tell, but because I was a piano student, I played William Tell on stage and then ran out into the orchestra pit and played the William Tell overture on the piano, and then ran back up on stage and finished my job as William Tell.
Wow. Who played the apple?
Somebody very light. And I worked in theater and enjoyed doing theater all through high school, and went to Amherst College in Massachusetts, where I majored in both theater and English literature. And
Were you going to movies through this time, or really just concentrating on theater?
I was going to movies, and I remember my very first film was Pollyanna, which may or may not account for my generally sunny disposition. I remember a particular experience, my cousins taking me to, this was at a theater in Washington Heights in the city, to Disney's Babes in Toyland, which starred, I remember, Annette Funicello and Tommy Sands and Ray Bolger and Ed Wynn. And at some point, about a third of the way into the movie, there was a special effects. Either the soldiers grew in size or shrunk to miniature, and it completely freaked me out. And they had to, we were sitting in the balcony, and they had to carry me screaming out of the theater. Fortunately, I regained my love of film. And I think the most influential or the film dearest to my heart from my childhood was The Sound of Music. I pretty much know not only every song, every lyric, but every piece of dialogue from The Sound of Music.
And they played it Sunday night again. Took them 4 hours with the amount of commercials.
Oh yeah, no, it's an incredible film, and I think also because my parents escaped Germany, or my mother in particular escaped Germany during the war, I had a personal connection to it, but I'm also a big fan of the musical form, so I loved it for all of that.
Wow. Now, you were acting always in theater? Were you directing? Were you casting?
Well, I was definitely the first two. I was acting in plays, as I mentioned, from an early age, and then in high school I began to direct. And I really found a voice in directing, which I continued to do at Amherst. I directed several plays while also acting in other plays, and then began doing summer stock in Vermont, in Weston, Vermont, at the Weston Playhouse. So my world sort of, year round was very much centered on the theater, and I did not really focus on film and television until I moved back to Manhattan after.
Let me ask you a question. The theater you were doing, were you, as an actor, were you doing, Oklahoma and Sound of Mute and South Pacific, or were you doing Long Day's Journey into Night,
A pretty good mix of both, really. I was in high school, we did some very adventurous theater thanks to a wonderful teacher. We all know how influential those teachers can be. And we did a production of Marat Sade and a production of JB, which is the story of Job, along with, and I directed a Noel Coward musical review. And each year we did a fully staged opera presentation in high school. So I was a singer, and I starred in in Puccini's Turandot. And then in summer stock, we did Summer Stock Fair, which were all of the wonderful musicals you just mentioned.
Wow. I just, I've known you a long time, but we've never had this conversation, and
We haven't.
I'm so excited to get to hear all this.
Well, thanks for your interest.
So you graduated college, and now you moved to Manhattan, and were you auditioning as a director? Were you auditioning as an actor?
None of it. I actually had decided that I was really suited. As I looked ahead to my career, I realized, and I knew in my bones, that the career of an actor is so dependent on the decisions of others and very often on the whim of others. And I really felt that I wanted to pursue a career where I was a bit more in command of my fate. I didn't really know what that was. Truthfully, since I have no one in the family who was in show business, I pursued everything available. Amherst College had a directory of alumni that I poured through to find the handful of people who were in show business. And the first thing I did after graduating school was I got a job as a waiter at a seafood restaurant called Sea Breeze Off the Park. It was just off of Central Park, next to the Dakota, the famous apartment building.
72nd.
72nd and Central Park West. And I was there for a couple of months, served a lot of shrimp, and then there was an Amherst alumnus who had been an NBC page at 30 Rockefeller Plaza. And I contacted him. We were part of, we had different years, but he was in the same a cappella singing group that I was in school, because I spent a lot of time with a cappella singing. And he got me an interview at NBC to become a page. And I put on a blue blazer with a peacock on it. And as you may know about the page program at NBC, you're not only a page as in an usher, but you are also a substitute staff person when somebody goes on a holiday. So I sat at desks and filled in at all the various departments at NBC, and I learned a lot. Worked in marketing, public relations, and for a while I sat at the desk of a man who was head of, or I guess he was senior vice president of late night programming. And at that point at NBC, there wasn't that much television production in terms of dramatic programming. There was the news department, there were soap operas, and there was Saturday Night Live. And Saturday Night Live reached its sort of height of fame while I was in college, and this was right after I graduated. So I was hoping that I could possibly get a job on SNL. And because of my having sat in as a page in the late night production office at the network, I got to know the vice president of late night. And I then became head page, head usher at Saturday Night Live. And the combination of those two connections, when a job came up on the production staff of Saturday Night Live, that was my first professional job in show business.
Wow. So you worked for Lorne.
I worked for Lorne. It was the last season and a half of the original cast. So it was Belushi and Aykroyd and Gilda and Jane Curtin, Lorraine Newman, Garrett Morris, only Chip
Our top story tonight.
Yes. Well, interestingly, the area that I was hired to work on was Weekend Update. I was the PA on Weekend Update, and I spent many an hour, particularly in Gilda Radner's dressing room, with Alan Zweig-Bell, who used to write all of Gilda's material. You know, Emily Latella and Rosanna Dana, all those characters she played.
Barbara Wawa.
All of those, and I was there with, Mimeo paper and carbon probably back in the day, and making script revisions. And then I would, Mimeo off all of the pink pages and yellow pages and blue pages for the scripts. And also I was responsible for getting, once on Weekend Update, they always had photos like on a news broadcast, and very often they would alter the photos for comic effect. Right. And this was the days before, of course, fax machine and email. And they sent me around New York, running all over the place to all of the wire services, to AP and UPI, Reuters, and I would pick up photos from their photo departments and bring them back to a guy at 30 Rock, who would then prepare them and alter them for the broadcast. So Weekend Update was mostly an end-of-week job. So most of my work was, Thursday, Friday, and then, of course, Saturday until the wee hours, because a news broadcast has to be current. So it was a wild time to be in your early 20s in that environment, of Saturday Night Live, which was insane and intense, and it sort of reminded me a little bit of that movie, Richard Benjamin's movie, My Favorite Year, where this young stunky kid gets put together with a Sid Caesar-like character played by Peter O'Toole, and sort of has to deal with the sort of maelstrom of live television, and that's sort of how I felt back in the day, and it was a formative experience, needless to say.
Just an off thing. A woman who was almost like my sister was the head art director at that time, Edie Baskin, who did all of the pictures and everything. So I'm sure you were close.
Well, yes, and she's influenced all of the, all the photos that they show before and after commercials, into and out of commercials. That was all Edie's work.
I'm still talk to her every week.
Well, I have, obviously great affection for all that. And years later, I worked with Bill Murray on a film, and we, I go back way back, because he and Jane Curtin were the hosts of Weekend Update back in the day. So that was certainly formative.
Wow. And then at that time, were you thinking, what am I going to do next, or you were just enjoying your life as this?
I was enjoying my life on SNL until Lorne Michaels made an announcement that he was going to leave the show the following year.
I remember this.
The entire cast at that point really were becoming movie stars. They were, and every time there was a break in production, they would hop on a plane and go out to Hollywood and film whatever it was. Belushi had obviously become a big star through Animal House, but they were all making movies. And they had really, at that point, had sort of had enough of the live television grind. So we all on the staff started to kind of scramble for work. And I coincidentally, at NBC, met a woman who was head of casting on the East Coast for the network, and her name was Mary Goldberg. Yeah. And Mary Goldberg wasn't long at the network when I met her. She was, for years, the head of casting at Joseph Papp's Public Theater downtown in the Village, legendary theater company. And she took this job at this corporation. She wasn't sure she would love it. And fairly early on, she had lost her assistant and was looking for somebody initially as a temp. And I took that job. And that was my first casting job. But I should probably backtrack a little bit and talk about my relationship to the professional theater in New York, because that really is where I think my love of actors and my appreciation of casting came into play. When I was a teenager, and this is in early teens, I would say 14, 15, I went to Broadway shows from a very early age. My mother was in a group of women who bought subscriptions to the Lincoln Center Repertory Company and other theaters, and quite adventurous theaters in the Village. And whenever one of these housewives couldn't make a play engagement, I took their ticket. And I saw plays that I probably shouldn't have been seeing at the ages of 10, 11, and 12. Sam Shepard plays. I remember seeing a double bill of One Acts Downtown, written by Elaine May and Terrence McNally. Excuse me. So I became hooked on theater, and I would, all through high school and junior high, take the train to New York, get the cheapest theater ticket I possibly could. Those days we called them twofers, 2-for-1 tickets. And very often I would do what we called second act of play, which is I would go to a theater, I would find out when the intermission was, and I would go outside the theater, and when people came out for a smoke, they would drop playbills on the sidewalk, and I would pick up a playbill, and I would walk into the theater, and in the back of the orchestra, and as the lights came down for the second act, I would dart my eyes around the orchestra to see where an empty seat was, and I would scoot into an empty seat, and that way I saw the second act of many, many shows. But what I also did was when I knew I was seeing a play, first and second acts, I wrote a note. I had these little note cards with my, initials engraved. I'm sure it was something that somebody gave me from my bar mitzvah. And I wrote a note to the star of the show. And I would write, for example, "Dear Angela Lansbury, My name is David Rubin. I'm a student of the theater. I'm looking forward to seeing your performance today. If there's any way that you could leave my name at the stage door, I would be thrilled and delighted to meet you. So a version of that. And then I would knock on the door of the stage door, and some guy, the typical cigar chomping stage door guy, would answer, and I would say, could you please give this to Angela Lansbury? He took it, and I would tell you 95 to 98% of the time after the show, I would go to the stage door and my name would be left at the stage door and I would be ushered into the star's dressing room. And in that period of about, I don't know, 4 or 5 years, I met all of the leading lights of Broadway who invited me in. I have no idea why they wanted to talk to me, except that I was avid and I probably asked a lot of eager questions. But the generosity of those people, countless wonderful people. I mean, I remember there was Sammy Cahn, the great Oscar-winning composer, did a show of his own on Broadway called Sammy Cahn Words and Music, and it was him telling stories and singer-singing. I did the same thing there. He invited me back, and I had such a great time. He said to me, you know, if you ever find yourself in the theater district and you don't have a backstage to go to, just stop by, tell a stage door guy. So I used to periodically go back to Sammy Cahn's dressing room, and you can only imagine the people that visited Sammy Cahn after these shows. You know, it was like a version of the Rat Pack in his dressing room, and my eyes were, I'm sure, wide as saucers. But, you know, I got a sort of, interestingly, as a teenager, I spent time sort of intimately connecting with actors. I had no idea that later on that was actually going to be my path professionally. Wow. But it was, in fact, somewhere, I don't know if you can even see it, down here on these bookshelves, these black binders are playbills from my very first Broadway show to present day. They're organized chronologically. Yes, I'm that much of a theater nerd. And many of them are autographed by the people that I spoke with backstage at their show.
You had such courage. I mean, that takes courage. Most people in life are so afraid of ever, you know, moving forward. That's phenomenal.
I have no idea what possessed me to do it other than a passion for the form. You know, I just loved going to the theater. But, you know, and I will tell you, I know there's lots to talk about in between, but, you know, now that I have had success as a casting director, and I am able to, because people are very eager for me to see their clients in shows, and I'm able to get a prime seat to any tough ticket in town. When I sit down in those seats, when I used to sit in the back of the rear mezzanine, I get extremely, and I am getting it now, extremely choked up about the trajectory of my life, because I did anything, including scooping up programs off the sidewalk to see these plays, and to know that I have that kind of access to that talent and to that form is extremely moving to me.
Well, one of the things that I've always known about you is your heart, and it's huge. And now I understand even more. So you're with Mary Goldberg. Now, how do you get to a man I worked with a lot, Lynn Stallmaster?
Well, I wasn't with Mary long at NBC because a couple of months in, of course, then we used to, before IMDb, there was a thing called the Player's Guide, which was a big, thick book of little photos of every actor in town. And honestly, my first, you have a copy there?
I was looking to see, I might have thrown it out.
You know, my first day on the job, I'm leafing through this thing, and I honestly didn't know that the job of casting director existed. But there I was looking at all these actors who I'd seen in all these plays and all these movies and stuff, and I honestly thought I had just landed in heaven. But a few months in, Mary got a call from great director Milos Forman, who was starting to prepare his film Ragtime, and asked if Mary would be interested in casting it. Mary at that point was, I think, being a little disillusioned by work at a network, and she said yes, and she asked me to go with her. So Ragtime was the first film I worked on, which enabled me not only to meet Milos and work on that film, and a great producer, Michael Hausman, But I got to meet James Cagney and his wife Millie, who used to, sort of hang around in the production office. And I just thought, this connection to old Hollywood was, extraordinary to me. And that was my first film experience.
Wow.
And with Mary, I began as her assistant and became her associate, and ultimately partnered with her on some films. And we worked with Mike Nichols on Silkwood, and we cast a play that Mike directed, which was a Tom Stoppard play called The Real Thing, which was the first time that I shared credit with Mary. And then we cast Amadeus in New York for Milos. And then Mary got a call from a talent agency from ICM in, I think it was actually first William Morris in LA, asking if she would ever consider becoming an agent. And one day she called me and said, I have some news. Whether it's good or bad, I don't know, but I'm going to move to LA and become an agent. And I didn't know what I was going to do. I had taken jobs with various casting directors as they came into town. When LA casting directors go to New York, very often they'll hire a local assistant or an associate to point the way and to run those sessions and all that. And I had done that for a casting director at the time named Tony Howard, who became an agent. That same week that Mary told me that she was going to move to LA to become an agent, I got a phone call from Tony Howard, who at that point was partnered with Lynn Stallmaster in a casting company. And she said, listen, somebody's leaving our office, and I told Lynn about you. I think you're great. Have you ever considered moving to Los Angeles? I had never considered moving to Los Angeles. Dyed in the wool New Yorker. But it was Lynn Stallmaster's office, and she said, look, Lynn has never hired somebody out of New York. He's not, crazy about the idea, but I convinced him to send you a plane ticket to come out to have a meeting. So he did that, and I came out, and I remember stayed with a friend who had moved out here, a high school friend. And I remember my drive from the top of Doheny down, it's sort of on a hill, and down and with palm trees lining the street. And it was a slightly out-of-body experience because I hadn't spent any time in Hollywood. I fully expected Carol Lombard to pull up in a Bentley next to me. It was a very Hollywood thing. And I met Lynn Stallmaster, and we had a great chat, and he offered me a job to join his company as his associate. And he essentially moved me to Los Angeles. Basically gave me a little stipend to, rent a car and to find an apartment, and that's how I
just have a question, because I've known Tony since high school. Okay.
Oh yes.
He was a cheerleader at Beverly High.
Yes, I know she went to Beverly High.
Well, now she's the one that pulls you to LA. Now it's blah 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 years later.
Yes.
When Tony calls,
she has never let me forget.
That's what I was going to say. Now, David, you have to use my actor.
When I resist seeing an actor of hers, she's rather quick to remind me about history.
I agree.
You saw that happen. You saw that coming. Listen, I do owe her a great deal for that recommendation, and Mary Goldberg was absolutely a mentor to me in many, many ways, particularly in her adventurous taste in actors and her fierce independence to go against others' opinions. But Lynn really is my true mentor and my dear friend to this day. He just turned 93 a couple of weeks ago.
We honored him just a few years ago.
Yeah. So it is, so that's what brought me to LA.
So let me ask you, when did you know, or how did you know that it was time to go out on your own?
Well, I worked on a number of movies with Lynn and enjoyed that collaboration tremendously. But what happened, and what I'd heard was happening, is that some filmmakers were calling the Stallmaster office and saying, I have a movie and we'd like to hire your company. But if at all possible, if David Rubin could be the point person on the film, we would appreciate it. So you don't have to be a genius to figure out that there may be an opportunity for you in the marketplace. Although, I had a very difficult time leaving the tutelage of Lynn Stallmaster. And he was great about it, and couldn't have been more supportive. And really, that friendship has lasted so strongly to this day. And the first person to call and ask that question to me directly was Richard Benjamin, who was going to direct a movie at Columbia. And when he called me, and then we had a brief conversation on the phone, I said, listen, I have to tell you something, and Lynn is aware of this, but I've made the decision. This was the time that I actually had the gumption to tell a filmmaker this. I've made the decision to move on from Lynn's office, and if that prompts you to want to work with somebody else, I completely understand, and please go and make a beautiful movie. I just wanted to tell you that I'm feeling like now's the time for me to do this, and he made the leap. And along with Jennifer Shull, who was head of casting at Columbia at the time, who approved it. And it was a wonderful experience. The movie was called Little Nikita, and it starred Sidney Poitier and River Phoenix.
Yeah. So I just have to stop you, David, because I had Mark Gordon on a couple of weeks ago, and I talked about what I love about Mark is his character and his sense of morality. And I just have to say that knowing you as long as I have, that little story right there of calling Benjamin and saying, if you don't want to, that's a terrific person. And it just,
thank you.
No, but really, David, it's very special in this business, because our business gets such a bad rap of all these, bad people who take advantage. And there are good people in our industry who don't take advantage, and you're one of them. So I just
thanks. I mean, to this day, if I get a call from a filmmaker, and I know that they've had a long relationship with another casting director, I will call that casting director and say, listen, I just want you to know I got this call. Tell me what's going on with your relationship with so-and-so, or I will ask the filmmaker whether he's resolved things with the long-term relationship that they had, because I'm not interested in poaching. I feel like there's enough work to go around, and so I do feel strongly about that.
So you're working with Dick Benjamin. It's your first movie without, somebody behind you. I'm sure Phil Gersh was calling and saying, now you take care of my client.
Maybe. I plead the fifth.
Yeah. But how did it go? I mean, you're all of a sudden you're having to, bring the book and the pictures and resumes and talk to a director totally on your own.
Well, what it did was it enabled me to hire all my beloved New York actors, because, and truthfully, for decades and decades, and still to this day, I feel most secure in hiring theater actors for the films I work on, because they are trained. They have the ability to do the groundwork for a role. So I've always been inclined toward those. And back in the day, again, before internet, we would travel to New York. I've never worked on a movie where we didn't get on a plane and spend several weeks in New York and meeting all the great actors there. And that was the case with Little Nikita. I think in his first film role, perhaps, but certainly an early film role, Richard Jenkins played a large role in that film, playing River Phoenix's father. Wonderful character actress named Carolyn Cava. Loretta Devine had just come off the stage in Dreamgirls, and we hired her to play a kind of potential love interest for Sidney Poitier. So, it was great because I was able to sit with Dick Benjamin and introduce him to all of these New York theater actors. And he himself was a New York theater actor when he began his career.
So it's interesting because I remember working with Irvin Kershner, long time ago, and on a movie called Up the Sandbox with Barbra Streisand. And I can't remember the name of the woman who played his mother, but she was a Broadway actress. And I remember Kirsch saying, "This isn't Broadway. We have your face. take it all down, take it back. And I wondered whether or not when you've met with them, because theater is so much broader and you're not 100, did you ever instruct them into, when you go in for a movie interview, is there a difference? I guess.
Occasionally. I sometimes, yes, although I think that the stage actors who are best suited to film understand that I always say that the movie camera lens is the world's greatest bullshit detector. It can read thought. And what I do say to stage actors is, and actually this is a phrase that I borrowed from Tony Scott, I'm just realizing. He said, if you can think it, you can play it. Meaning you don't have to indicate anything, and you don't certainly have to worry about the front mezzanine or the rear mezzanine when you're playing the role. So everything is, thought and emotion can be read by the film camera lens, and that's pretty much all you have to, an actor then has to trust it. The work, the prep, the creation of a character is still the same. The only other distinction that I would make is that theater actors very often get the most joy from their training and from their theater work by playing characters that are way outside themselves. 50 years older with, old age makeup, a huge transformation in their voice and their accents and all of that. And I feel like that's the greatest. And as you can tell, I love watching that in the theater. But I think that actors for film best play a version of themselves in an artificial circumstance, in a story that's invented, but they find themselves in the character, which gives it, for the camera lens, a truth. There's no artifice in it. So if I have a conversation with a talent agent, let's say, about why an actor may be more or less right for a role, and I think that they are less right for it, the answer is not that they don't have the talent to play it on stage, but we will find somebody who is temperamentally and physically, perhaps, closer to the part, who will play it with a kind of honesty for film that will translate on a giant movie screen. So it's frustrating for theater actors sometimes when they don't get to play the range of roles that they did in the theater. But that's because of the very unique nature of performance through a camera lens. But yes, but New York actors always in my movies, and it started with Richard Benjamin.
Yeah, it's funny. I remember working on a movie that your predecessor John Bailey was going to direct. He didn't end up directing, but we couldn't get the cast, and we flew to New York, and in 2 days with Donna Isaacson, we cast the entire, and they're still around. It was Ving Rhames and Erica Alexander, all these people that you know. It was called The Long Walk Home with Sissy and Whoopi. But it reminded me of, yes, New York actors, boom, you got them. It's so much different than being in Hollywood.
Well, they have craft, they've studied, they've gone to drama school, remember, Hawk, that theater is the only medium in which an actor is fully in charge of their performance from the time the curtain goes up to the time the curtain goes down. So they've created an entire character, played an entire story while you're sitting there watching them. And that takes discipline, rehearsal, and craft. And, not every, this may be sacrilege, but not every film director is a great director of actors. People come to directing. People come to directing from various walks of life. There are writers who become directors, there are editors who become directors, cinematographers become directors, and not everybody gives actors what they need to get the performance. But a theater actor is a self-starter. They do the prep. If it's not handed to them by a filmmaker, they do the prep on their own. So again, another argument for my worship of theater actors.
So, and yet your home is in Los Angeles. You cast all these movies, and sometimes people don't have the money to bring somebody from New York to house them and do all the other stuff. Are you aware of how many of those New York actors have moved to LA for work. Is that
Absolutely, yes. I keep track of the diaspora, and I think, and they're countless. I mean, I'm sure there are, people watching this conversation who, whatever decade they came to Los Angeles, made the same journey, and there are lots of reasons. I don't apologize for having moved to California. I love it, and I had a very jaundiced view of Hollywood or California before I moved here. I thought that people were basically just lounging at their poolside and doing no work. And what I realized is that the business in Los Angeles is twice as obsessive as it is anywhere, including New York.
right? An associate of yours, Richard Hicks, who I worked with you, has called you a beacon of gracious light. I know you to have a very even temperament. Now, was that always the case, or am I not seeing, what's that? Molly's a Jungian analyst, so what's the darker side, David? There must be a dark side to you somewhere.
Well, it may take sitting on a couch with Molly, but I think I increasingly over the years became more even keeled. When you're young, everything seems dire and critical, and then as you age, the things that you thought were a 10 are a 7.5, maybe a 6, and you sort of find perspective. I think my instinct is when things get crazy, instead of matching it with my crazy, I go under. I tend to really, I don't know. My instinct is to get quiet, to be analytical, and I think I learned along the way. I don't know that I was ever an hysteric. And partly, I actually hadn't thought of this before, but some of it may have to do with my being an only child in a quiet household, because I didn't have the drama of sibling rivalry. I didn't have a family that was screaming at each other across a dinner table. So maybe I don't even have the muscles, the emotional muscles, to behave in that way. So I figure it out on my own, and I sort of do it quietly.
So you've worked with producers and directors that are, let's say, varied. I've worked with some of them, but how do you adapt, or do you adapt to Mel Brooks as opposed to Warren Beatty or Anthony Minghella? I mean, how does that, do you think through, do you do research on them before you get with them and kind of try and figure out what the best way is?
I don't know how much research I did, but you very quickly in conversation get a sense of who they are and what their relationship is to the casting process. You're absolutely right, Hawk. Everybody is very different in their approach. And there is no real one way of engaging with the casting process, but you do have to make people feel comfortable with the process. That doesn't mean that I can't introduce new ways of doing things. If you'd like me to be specific, I'm happy to be specific.
Well, one question I have, because I've known Mel for many, many years. When I'm in a room with Mel, you have to have a sense of humor. It's repartee all the time, and yet I've worked with Sidney Pollack, and it's a whole different,
right,
kettle of fish.
Right. Well, with Mel, it is very much the Mel Brooks show, and you are a very happy and willing participant and audience member for a lot of it. So I would say that a lot of the conversation is not about casting. It's about, he's the ultimate, tumbler. He's the guy who, went from table to table, maybe he still does, at the Fox commissary, and has people in stitches. The good news with that, and I remember exactly where I was when I got a call from Mel Brooks asking me to work on his film. I was at the now long gone Mayflower Hotel on Central Park West. I was working on a movie in New York. And when I heard that, Mel Brooks was on the other end of the phone, I nearly died, because I was the most ardent fan of the 2,000-Year-Old Man routines. And I listened to them as a kid and all through college. And even every once in a while with Mel, I got to add a line from the 2,000-year-old man into a conversation, which of course he loved. But a lot of it is about the world of Mel, and every once in a while we would talk about actors.
And Mel actually can get serious, because I've seen him.
Oh, absolutely.
On a dime.
He was an enormously bright man, and the reason he hired me, and I was comparatively, a young casting director at the time, is that he had worked for so many years with a rep company of brilliant comedic actors, and a number of them are still in Spaceballs. But he had younger characters in that, somebody to play Harrison Ford's character, somebody to play Carrie Fisher's character, and all of that. And he wanted somebody who was in touch with that community of actors, to bring a kind of freshness, and maybe it was also urged by the studio. But it was a dream come true, and I have such affection for him, and I do run into Mel occasionally, and he's one of the greats of all time.
And so,
but Sidney's a different story. Because Sidney was an actor first and an acting teacher, because he was Sandy Meisner's
Neighborhood Playhouse, right?
At the Neighborhood Playhouse, he was Sandy Meisner's teaching assistant initially, and became a great acting teacher himself. He had such compassion for the actor's plight that he hated the audition process. He didn't want to put actors through it. So by the time I worked with him, the first time, I cast many movies with Sidney, but the first one was The Firm. And at that point, videotape was becoming part of the casting process. And that was music to Sidney's ears, because he didn't actually have to sit in a casting session, and he preferred me to do all of the casting sessions. And then he and I would sit and watch all the auditions and talk about it. So he didn't personally have to put anybody through what he considered the agony of the audition. He loved actors, and it's because of his love of actors that kept him from engaging. There are other directors like Danny DeVito, with whom I did so many movies, who you can imagine had a huge appetite for the casting process, and actors had a huge appetite to sit in a room with Danny and experiment. So everybody's, quite different.
Okay, all right. Now, someone you and I know very well. Tell me about the casting experience with WB.
Well,
Warren Beatty,
to get a call from Warren Beatty is another slightly out-of-body experience, and so was the process. Although, stimulating always, and that's part, I would say, for two reasons. His fierce intelligence, extraordinary, and Warren is somebody. I mentioned earlier that I got to meet and spend a tiny bit of time with James Cagney. Warren is somebody who came to Hollywood at a very early age and befriended wisely and strategically the great filmmakers of another era. And he literally sat at the knee of all of these wonderful film directors and asked a million questions, which he's still asking, which he's asking still today.
Yeah.
And my working with Warren was sort of, and he's also, as a result, has become one of the great raconteurs of all time and tells unbelievable stories of his journey in Hollywood. And I am, as I guess I was backstage at all those Broadway shows, I am the greatest audience for those stories. And so, yeah, I'm sure you were too. So, or are too. So I, there were days where we got, nothing done, but he told some fantastic stories. And he was also happy to get nothing done on some days. And then some days he was sort of voraciously, manically focused on the movie that we were making. And, he is somebody who is endlessly inquisitive, but also endlessly suspicious and paranoid. But to the end of the benefit of his film. But, I do believe that if you're buying a car and, you kick the tires long enough and often enough, the tires fall off. So, I kept on feeling like I was involved in these very circular conversations with Warren that didn't necessarily move the needle forward, but they were these very stimulating Socratic arguments in favor and against various casting decisions. And it took a very long time. And with Warren, this was the only time this happened. First of all, he's in the rare position, or was certainly when we made that movie, to schedule his film in chronological order. So he shot it absolutely in sequence. And likewise, he didn't really finish writing the end of the movie until he had shot some of the movie. And concurrently, or as a result, he didn't want to cast the end of the movie until he shot the beginning of the movie. So this is the only time in my career where I was hired not only for the pre-production period, but for the entire shoot of the movie. I had a trailer on set. I would go at call time every morning, and I would wait for Warren to have time to talk about casting, which very often was, since he was also starring in this film, lunchtime. So I would then go to his trailer and have a few minutes to talk about, characters. And sometimes I would go to the set and we would talk about them. But it was, always on his instinct and his time. The good news was I was working on another film at the time, and I was able to do a lot of telephone work from my trailer. But no one else works that way. It's and what it is, it's full immersion. He had me involved in helping choose key extras, which I had never done before. And that kind of obsessive detail is really impressive and is in evidence on the screen. But obsession has its other side too.
I guess it's interesting because I think by the end of making Heaven Can Wait with him, he actually trusted me. But then the next time he didn't again.
Oh, really? Well, no, I think there's trust. He was enormous. I don't mean for a minute to say that there was a lack of respect. He was extremely respectful. But in addition to the in-depth conversation he was having with me, I knew that he was having similar conversations with many other people. Because of the wonderful relationships he has, he is, interested in what a lot of people think. And then he will either go and do something completely different because it's his gut, or he will use the accumulated wisdom he has gained from all those conversations to make a very informed decision.
Right. Okay, so now this is a question that we've talked about before, and maybe you can give me an example. How do you convince a producer and director to go with an actor or an actress that you really believe in, and they're on the fence or they're thinking somewhere else? Do you have an example of one that just you had to convince them? And I'm not saying you can wave a flag and say, I discovered Clark Gable or something, but
yeah, no, I never think of that. I mean, I think it's one of the reasons why I've never had interest in becoming a manager or an agent, is that I hope every actor has a long and prosperous career, but my relationship with actors is circumstantial in that I'm so focused on the roles on a particular movie that I'm hoping that the actor we cast will do a million other films, but I'm really only focused on that particular movie. I don't have great anecdotes about going to battle for actors, but I can tell you how I orchestrate the conversation, because I find that directors and producers are bombarded by a million things, by a million decisions, by a million departments, by agents, and sometimes, even though they've been working on a movie for a decade to try to bring it to fruition, all of that cloud of talk and questions being answered and all of that needs to be focused. And I do feel that we're called casting directors, not because we're directors, but because we direct the casting process. We keep everybody's eye on the ball, on the prize. And sometimes I have to point out to a director who is particularly passionate about a particular idea, casting idea, that it might not be best. And the first thing I do is go to the script and talk about the way that character impacts the narrative, and talk about key moments in the screenplay that an actor has to land the sort of benchmarks of the character. And I talk about how one actor will more likely hit all of those benchmarks and therefore deliver the performance that we want, versus someone else who, in the abstract, sounds like a good idea. But when you actually think about the story being told, isn't the best idea. Or if it's an idea that is sort of out of left field, you talk about what it might do, how it might spin the story. I actually remember I was casting The War of the Roses for Jim Brooks was producing and Danny DeVito was directing. And there was a character of a Michael Douglas and Kathleen Turner had a sort of nanny housekeeper. And it was scripted as a kind of a young, sort of Candy Striper type high school, college girl who was stuck in the middle of this war between these two characters. And it felt a little conventional.
A young Arlene Golunka.
No, not that.
I go back a long time, David.
I haven't heard that name in a long time. And I had recently seen a German film called Sugar Baby that starred an overweight Munich-based character actress named Marianne Sagebrecht. And it's a killer performance. She also starred in, a movie that took place in Palm Springs. It'll occur to me. Anyway, and that was before we were able to get on a Zoom call with an actor in Germany. But I was so passionate about this idea, and I got Danny a print of the movie, I think, and he fell in love with her and a million phone calls later and all of that. And she really spun that character and everything that happened in that household in War of the Roses very, very differently. So, it's bringing it back to the story, the narrative, and bringing it back to the script is the surest way to get people focused, aside from the craziness of pre-production. Hello? Are you there? Hello?
Yeah, I lost something for a minute.
It got terribly quiet. I missed you already.
Yes. Well, so I have I remember when we were casting Primal Fear, and Deb Aquila had seen about 2,500 young boys and got so excited for us to meet this and test this one boy. Of course, it was Edward Norton. And I'm just wondering if there's a moment or several where you're working on a script, you're working on a movie, and you're auditioning people, and all of a sudden you go, oh my God, this is Edward Norton or whoever.
Right.
Is there one that stands out for you?
Well, it's not, yeah, I mean, in a case similar to what I said before, it's not necessarily that we cast somebody who then immediately shots to fame in a lot of movies, but those kind of in-depth searches are really the sort of the true essence of what casting is. You're not worried about a marquee. You don't have a studio saying we're going to sell this movie on this particular actor, and it's open season really for just finding the right person, and it's enormously rewarding. I cast a musical, a film adaptation of a wonderful Broadway show called Hairspray. And we did a nationwide search for a plus-size actress who was a wonderful actress, a wonderful singer, a wonderful dancer, and could hold their own opposite the likes of John Travolta and Michelle Pfeiffer and Christopher Walken. It involved, again, back in the day when we did open calls, before you put out a notice on the internet and just waited for the incoming videos. And part of the search, just like it was for the search for Vivian Lee back in Gone with the Wind days, it was also part of the marketing machine of the movie, the search for Tracy Turnblad in Hairspray. And we did open calls in New York and Chicago and San Francisco, and a special open call in John Waters' hometown of Baltimore, and countless other places. I mean, I was on the plane more than I was home in Los Angeles. And each place we went to, there was a line of plus-size teenage girls circling the block and singing their hearts out. And then eventually somebody comes in and has all of those, ticks all those boxes. A woman named Nikki Blonsky, a young girl named Nikki Blonsky, who just, blew us away. And here's the irony of ironies. She's from my high school. and did musical theater on the same stage that I did musical theater back in high school. I had no idea until after we hired her, or just very much down the road. So that's what I guess Oprah Winfrey would call a full circle moment.
Wow. So I have a Bob Beecher had to go. He's going to watch this later, but he did. He was very close with Anthony Minghella. So could you talk a little bit about the casting of The English Patient and your work with Tony?
I can happily talk about that. Anthony Minghella has been to date my closest collaboration with any filmmaker, and my closest friendship among peers, period. We met shortly after his first movie was released, a movie called Truly, Madly, Deeply. And he was hired by actually John Rothman, who was working at Goldwyn at the time, to direct a movie that he had revised, a script he had revised. It was called Dear Mr. Wonderful. It ended up being his first American film. And it was that first meeting was as though I knew I was meeting somebody that was going to be in my life. It was one of those sort of deeply personal connections. And we made that movie in New York with an all New York cast. A lot of wonderful people playing Tony roles. I remember James Gandolfini's first film role. And it starred Matt Dillon and Annabella Sciorra. And that began a long collaboration, and I cast every single film that Anthony directed after that. So certainly The English Patient and The Talented Mr. Ripley and Cold Mountain, and including the television show, the #1 Ladies Detective Agency. And we became family members, really, and a real shorthand. When we were doing The Talented Mr. Ripley, I remember there was a part that I just read the script, put it down, and I knew that Philip Seymour Hoffman was going to play this character of Freddie Miles. And I said, look, I can show you, 15 people, but it's Philip Seymour Hoffman. He did not know Philip Seymour Hoffman. I showed him 3 clips, and they had one phone conversation, and he said, yep, it's Philip Seymour Hoffman. There was a shorthand in my relationship with him that I've had since with other directors, Sidney Pollack for sure, and Jean-Marc Vallée and Danny DeVito and others. But nothing like my friendship with Anthony. The English Patient was a struggle to get made, in that it was in pre-production at Fox for a very long time. Sets were being built in Morocco, and we did a table reading in London of the proposed cast. So Ray Fiennes and everybody, and when Fox heard of the unknown British actors that we were going to cast, they said, no, you have to cast stars. And Paul Zantz, the great maverick producer of The English Patient, with whom I had worked on
Saul Zantz.
Sorry? Oh, Saul Zantz, sorry. Paul is his nephew, whom I also did many movies with. Saul Zantz said to Fox, listen, if you're going to dictate who's going to be in this movie, I'm going to see if we can set it up someplace else. So he notified all the crew members who were building all these sets, and they said, I'm sorry, we're committed to Anthony. We're going to continue working. We're going to sew costumes. We're going to build sets. And Saul said, just give me a couple of weeks. And that's when, to his credit, Harvey Weinstein stepped up and financed that film. But it's an amazing and unique movie, and the fact that it had the success that it did, because it has this wonderful sort of elliptical storyline and telling multiple stories at once. It was a complex novel that Anthony developed, but that was his genius, is the adaptation of great novels, including The Talented Mr. Ripley and Cold Mountain, and making them their own animal, not being slavish to the original, but creating something completely fresh. Needless to say, shortly after I think we had done the #1 Ladies Detective Agency, it actually, within the span of a year, 2 giant figures in my professional life and in my personal life, Sidney Pollack and Anthony Minghella, died unexpectedly and rather rapidly. Anthony very quickly from a hospital stay. Not only was I their casting directors, But I closed my casting office for nearly 7 years because I was interested in working more in production. And Sidney Pollack hired me to be a producer at his company, Mirage. And shortly after I was hired as a producer at Mirage, Sidney said, I have a surprise. I am going into business with Anthony Minghella, and now you're working with both of us at Mirage. And it was one of the most joyous days of my life, just as their passing was one of the darkest days of my life. But I hear their advice, I hear their voices constantly in everything I do.
Right. Well, I didn't know Anthony, but I knew Sidney very well. My dad actually gave Sidney his first movie to make. It was called The Slender Thread.
Yeah.
Wow. And I worked on his second film, This Property is Condemned. But I want to shift gears now because we don't have much time left. You're involved in something called the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences.
Yes, have you heard of it? Ex-President Koch?
And I must say, having been in the room as a governor with you, when did you start to? Because obviously, as I hear your whole life story in front of me, you obviously were very well organized. And for those of you out here, by the way, one of the reasons why when we said, do you have an hour and a half for us today? And he said, well, I've got 4 hours of watching tapes from London. And I was zooming from London. I'm thinking, my God, thank you, David. In the midst of all this, you're still casting something right now.
I'm casting a film for Sony, a movie version of a great novel called Where the Crawdads Sing.
Oh, sure. Well, Molly will be very excited.
I'm in the midst of all of that, but I'd rather be here than any place else.
So, at any rate, all right. So now you at the time, casting directors were part of the members at large, and you got to be I guess a governor from the members at large. How did you get to be a governor?
No, I joined the Academy, I think in 1991, and for years we were members at large, which is a group of people from a million different disciplines in filmmaking who aren't represented by a branch. It struck me that all of and it didn't only strike me, but many of my casting colleagues, that all the people that are credited in the main titles of motion picture, writers, directors, cinematographers, production designers, costume designers, editors, had branches at the Academy and were valued to the extent that they were given that esteemed credit in the opening titles of a film. And casting directors did not have a seat at the table at the Academy. And it actually started many, many years before it ultimately came to pass, where a wonderful casting director named Mike Fenton and I made a presentation to the then Board of Governors suggesting that they consider creating a branch for casting directors, given our relationships with filmmakers and the credit that we're given. And that went absolutely no place. The Academy has historically been, and I think this culture is changing, but had historically been, sort of hidebound to tradition, and to make any significant changes at the Academy was an uphill climb. And it wasn't until Hawk Koch became president of the Academy and understood, probably and conceivably more than any other president since, prior to that, what casting directors really do. At one point, picked up the phone and said, things are happening with branch organizations and such, and I think this may be a time. This may be a time to have a dialogue about casting directors having their branch. And at that point, I might have been head of a committee of casting directors, but I was still a members at large person. And we galvanized our other casting directors, and more specifically, filmmakers and producers, who are the people with whom we do our job. I know why casting is an underappreciated field, because we do our job and are gone before everybody else comes onto a movie set and does their job. So there's no real connection. Plus, we do our work behind closed doors. It's us and a director, or it's us and a director and a producer. So no one is privy to the nuanced collaboration that results in the casting. If anybody was sitting outside, all they would see is us bringing actors into a room and ushering them out of a room. So, you know, we might just be ushers. But the truth is, this dialogue about how each choice of an actor impacts a story is crucial. So we campaigned first to the membership committee of the Academy and then ultimately to the Board of Governors. And as a result, I was named one of the first 3 governors of the newly formed casting directors branch.
Right. And you weren't named.
Thanks to you.
You were voted. Huh?
Thanks in no small part to your encouragement and support.
Oh, well, thank you. I didn't ask that question for this. It was.
But I'm happy to be able to say it on this broadcast.
It was more about, okay, now you're on the board, and now having been in all different meetings throughout your life, you're seeing, you know, 50 people from all different walks of our industry. When did you think of being an officer, and when did, because for me, I've never really thought about, wow, if there's a chance I could be president, and do I want to be president, until about 6 months before it happened. And I wondered what happened.
Mine was probably even closer to the night it happened. I didn't ever think of it. And
you've been an officer for a couple of years, I think.
Well, that also was a kind of a gradual thing. The governors serve on various committees, and I ended up serving under the great screenwriter Phil Robinson's committee, which was membership and governance, I think it was at the time, and I discovered my inner wonk. My inner sort of governance wonk, who was interested in how the organization is structured and how it might be optimized. And Phil got me involved in redrafting the bylaws of the Academy. And I realized that I enjoyed it. I was always, you know, sort of a partial writer and a bit of a wordsmith. And I enjoyed working with Phil on that. And then the next year he said, you know, I'm writing a movie and I could use help. Would you be a co-chair of this committee? And I became his co-chair. And that sort of got me into it. And then I think when Phil was leaving the board and we had officer elections, he was secretary of the Academy, which is the person who deals with membership and governance. And I think it became a sort of an evolution where, I was suddenly being considered for the position of that office of secretary. And I was elected secretary, and I became one of the 7 officers of the board. And then I was reelected to secretary. And I think, I enjoy it so much in terms of trying to, first of all, make peace in the room, and to gain, and not that there's division really at this juncture. I think it's a very harmonious group, but it's about consensus building. And truthfully, consensus building is what I do every day as a casting director. I take a lot of different opinions about who can play what part and direct that process so that we end up with one person that we all agree is the answer. And I've kind of applied that to my work as an Academy officer and now to my work as president. It's the same drill, maybe cutting a larger swath, but it is the same conversation.
So you've come in at an incredibly difficult time with COVID and having to deal with all of this. Can you talk about what your favorite part of being president and what part of being president you want to, not me.
Well, I there's not much of it that I don't really relish. I think having access and relationships to a broader segment of the motion picture business, which means having a real relationship with people like Bob Iger and other studio heads and Jim Giannopoulos and many other people who I admire so much for the work they've done for years, and also their perspective on leadership. Learning so much about what being a leader is. And also being able to connect with the people who do the work on films that happen after I leave as casting director. So relationships with people in post-production, visual effects people whom I never see on a movie because they're mostly post-production people, editors, the people from all of these various arts and sciences. So that's, it fills in all of the blanks for me in film, and I feel like I have a full encompassing idea of what movie making is. The pandemic has been, a real challenge, although I am so proud of the staff and the members who've rolled with the punches. We have not held back on any initiatives and programs, and the Student Academy Awards, which we broadcast virtually, was as moving a ceremony as I've ever seen, and audiences are much larger than the Golden Theater could ever hold. So I think our outreach on social media and our connection to members, in a strange way, as hard as this pandemic has been greater than it's ever been. And we just sent out a member survey for the first time, I think, in years easily, to hear from members. And part of my mandate to myself as president is to not make the Academy some ivory tower. I used to say that it feels like the Vatican of show business. People are, nothing is revealed, and every once in a while there's smoke out of a chimney. And I think we've tried to be more transparent and done
a really good job with that, David.
And I think even in terms of increasing diversity and being a more international organization, we're trying to change the culture. When I was elected president, I said no one ever really said this was the American Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. Movies are an international art form. So we've tried to connect the world through cinema in palpable ways, and I'm hoping that we've made some headway.
Speaking of cinema, in what my definition of cinema is, why do you think the theatrical motion picture matters?
For the same reason why I fell in love with going to the theater as a child. I believe there is something primal in mankind that benefits from human beings gathering to tell stories and to hear stories. It happened in prehistoric caves. It happened at the Acropolis in ancient Greece. And it is essential to this day. So, just as I talk about my emotional feeling about sitting in a Broadway theater, I have the same feeling in a movie theater. And I think it is essential and primal. And I think the idea of losing that, which I don't think we will, I believe primal things stick around. They were called primal for a reason. And I believe that it is an absolute instinct of humankind to gather, to hear stories collectively. So no matter how convenient it is to screen movies in your home, it's circumstantial, obviously, in the pandemic, and it took a big hit that we are obviously contending with. Right.
So you believe when we can, people will rush back to the movie theater?
I do, as soon as there's confidence in safety and also, movie theater owners need to make that experience as rewarding and comfortable as possible. And I'm not saying that there isn't an inflection point in moviegoing that may necessitate changes of some kind. I don't know what they'll be. I keep wondering why, if an independent movie manages to make it into theaters, is sold at Sundance and in theaters, I'm not sure why it needs to be as expensive as a blockbuster movie when you go to the theater. I'm sure there are economics that dictate it, but I wonder why there's not a sliding scale for movie prices. That's not just according to age, kids and seniors, but just in the movie itself. I think that there are, but essentially 100% that theatrical exhibition is here to stay. It's part of our DNA.
What are you most proud of?
I think I'm most proud, a couple of things come to mind. I'm most proud of my former assistants who have gone on to successful careers as casting directors, wonderful inspiring and inspired casting directors. I'm extremely proud of that my efforts were rewarded to make Lynn Stallmaster the first casting director recipient of an Oscar, because it was a way for me to give back and a way for me to shine a light in a very public way on an understandably under-recognized and underappreciated collaborator in film. I think I'm proud of the trajectory, quite honestly, of my career, which has been unanticipated. I didn't major in casting. I never aspired to be the president of the Academy. Things were, sort of evolutionary or became surprising moments. I didn't know that my first mentor would move to LA, and that week I would get a phone call about moving to LA. Life. I'm pleased when many of my gay friends died in a pandemic in the 80s that I have survived to become the first gay president of the Motion Picture Academy. Things that remind you of the joys and satisfactions of life, longevity and friendship, love, all the good stuff.
I can't tell you, I've had the best hour and a half that I can remember. I thank you so much. I know Jen is going to want to come on, but my last question, and I think it's the question Jen always asks, which is, what are your top 5 movies? Movies, not streamers.
Easily done, I think. Ingmar Bergman's Cries and Whispers. Behind that, probably many other Bergman films, partially because of they are the most actor-intensive films that I can think of. But I'm endlessly.
Boy, when you watch them, they're thinking.
Yes.
They're not talking very much. They're doing a lot of thinking.
And I love that in actors, as I said. 2 Kubrick films, A Clockwork Orange, which I snuck into a theater on the Upper East Side of Manhattan when it was, rated X, I think. And 2001: A Space Odyssey, which reminds me of the sort of dream-inducing power of movies. You're in the middle of that movie and you do think you're dreaming, and you don't even realize what's happened to you until the movie's over. That's power. And I'd have to say The Sound of Music, both as a nod to my childhood and my love of musicals and my love of Julie Andrews. And if I'm allowed to say one of my own, I would say The Talented Mr. Ripley, which to me is a complete movie, holds up to this day because I saw it again recently, and is emblematic of the huge heart and humanity of Anthony Minghella.
Great. David, I must tell you, I hope the residents and those of you on Facebook and Zoom have enjoyed it as much as I have. Jen, take over. Have you got anything you'd like to ask David?
I've just been drinking in the last hour and a half. I'm also an East Coaster. Broadway is my first love.
That's your jam?
That's my jam, for sure. We have modified this. The last question is, what's your favorite movie? We've modified it a little bit for the holidays in asking what's your favorite holiday movie, but because of your background, I also want to know what your favorite theatrical experience has been. So favorite holiday movie and then favorite theatrical experience.
Well, have you seen all these tables behind me? That's going to be a really tough thing to come down to.
I don't have as many as you do, but I've got 2 giant plastic containers just chock full. Yep.
I'll come over and organize them for you.
Thank you. I want us to be friends, David. I want us to be friends, seriously. Okay.
Available. I'm going to say it was a performance of Long Day's Journey into Night in the Village on Bleecker Street that starred Robert Ryan, Geraldine Fitzgerald, and the kids, the sons, were Stacy Keach and James Naughton.
Wow.
And you can imagine that was the cast. And you can imagine, given the actors I just mentioned, how long ago it was. And to this day, its power, the power of storytelling of Eugene O'Neill. I'm drawn toward family stories anyway. And I think it's, again, because I'm an only child, family stories are so fascinating and exotic to me that I'm drawn to them. So Long Day's Journey, that performance is seared in my mind.
Okay.
And the Christmas movie.
Didn't expect that one. I've got to go with It's a Wonderful Life. There's just nothing. There's nothing that matches it. And you know, a lot of it is not about Christmas, but you know, but a lot of it, you know, a lot of it is. And I can't.
That Shop Around the Corner, somebody mentioned also.
Love The Shop Around the Corner, which was made into a great Broadway musical. She Loves Me. You know, I cast a Christmas movie that is very much locked in its time in the 80s, a movie called Scrooge that starred Bill Murray. And
I disagree that it's locked in its time. We just rewatched that this week.
Really? Has it? I feel like that movie might not have aged well at all.
No, Carol Kane saved everything.
Well, that's true. That's true. She's literally the same today as she was then. But it introduced me to Dick Donner, and it was a reunion for me with Bill Murray from my Saturday Night Live days. So it's up there. And Sidney Pollack was a producer on it. But the movie itself, I don't know. We'll talk.
All right. If ever you want to come back, we have a weekly show called Cinephiles, which volunteers and residents get together and talk about their favorite films. We would absolutely love to have you. But my thanks, if I can indulge just one more second. This has been an incredibly challenging year. And one of the people that has stood up, as he has always stood up for MPTF, is Koch. He stepped into this unknown experiment that we decided to try with Creative Chaos, and not only became a guest on a number of our shows, but said, I've got an idea, let me see. And he stepped into this role as this incredible interviewer, bringing more people into the tent in a time that everybody needs to be connected while physically distanced. And I can't thank Hawk enough for everything that he has done.
I love it, and I love the home and the fund, and so I mean it's been a joy to me. So, and I want to wish everybody out there, just let's get through the next week, and let's get through till January 20th, and let's have a great 2021, everybody. Have some happy holidays.
Thank you, David. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, David.
Likewise. Thank you.
Jen. Thank you. Bud.
Thank you. So we are going to take a short break, but in that break, we're going to show you the wrap up of the credits for our week. And we'll come back to you here at MPTF with some special programming donated to us by Netflix.